Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today in the next webinar in our Midlands Research Culture Webinar series. We're joined by Emily and Jamie today. They're going to do a presentation and then this will follow on with a Q&A. There is a Q&A section at the top of the webinar, and then we will answer any questions kind of live at the end. Thank you to everyone attending. I know the weather's nice, you could be outside in the sun, but it's going to be a really interesting hour. So, and just to flag that this is being recorded. Obviously, we can't see you, and your mics are muted for a webinar, but we do use this as a resource, open kind of on our website, and it will also be on Emily and Jamie's resources afterwards, just if there's anything you want to follow up on, or if you'd like to cascade it because it's of use to further people. So I'm going to pass over to Emily and Jamie, and some slides will appear shortly.
Thank you so much. Let's just deal with the slide sharing first. Did rehearse this, so hopefully it will happen. All right, is that all visible?
Looks good, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, I'd like to first thank you so much to Ellen for creating this event and setting it up and advertising it. We've really appreciated the collaboration with Midlands Innovation so far. And I can see from those who have already joined the event that there's a range of people who know our work quite well, and some who don't know very much about us yet. So we'll sort of speak from a perspective that that you don't know much about what we're doing. But for those who are more familiar with our work, of course, feel free to ask more in-depth questions at the end. And we when we first started discussing the potential for this event with Midlands Innovation Group, we were sort of talking about the different work that we've been doing around equity and inclusivity in relation to doctoral education. And it seemed like a great opportunity to do a research culture event that spans two of our recent projects, both relating to doctoral admissions and relating to doctoral education, and particularly doctoral assessment. And we'll say more about those projects in a minute. So warm welcome. I'm Emily Henderson, based in Education Studies at the University of Warwick and Director of the Doctoral Education and Academia Research Centre, or DEAR, and James Burford is with me, who is also Director of the Centre, and we're both based in Education Studies. So in our presentation, first of all, we'll just introduce our research centre briefly, so you know the kind of context that we're speaking from. And then we're going to discuss two projects, one relating to doctoral admissions and the second one relating to reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances. And then we'll have a Q&A. And we're going to speak as sort of briefly and quickly as we can to both of those projects. So you'll see we're sort of cutting out some essential information like the findings from our literature review. We've really focused on just introducing the projects and giving the findings. But if you've got any more questions about the wider elements of the projects, we've got lots more to say, so do feel free to save your questions. So just to briefly introduce our DEAR Centre. So we're a cross-departmental centre at the University of Warwick, which we founded in October 23. So we're still quite new. And our core focus is on doctoral education. And so anything relating to the PhD, other doctoral degrees, supervision, how doctoral education policy is shaping up, etc. And the academic profession, thinking about pathways into the academic profession, thinking about inequalities within the profession, globalization, and so on. And some of our sort of three sort of vision statements, if you like, is that we specialize in research on social inequalities, focusing across various intersections. We do international research across a range of countries, and we aim to do impactful research that makes change to policy and practice whilst focusing on rigorous, innovative and critical research perspectives. And you can see a bit more of a detailed sense of our centre here. In relation to doctoral education, one of our really core aims is to make research careers, doctoral degrees in particular, more equitable, more inclusive. So the two projects that we're presenting here sit under that purple umbrella there on the left-hand side of the slides. But on the right-hand side as well, some of our other work relating to the academic profession and aiming for the academic profession to contribute to social transformation. And that includes a current project that I'm working on, widening access to higher education in India, which is about the role of academics in outreach culture in India. And then Heart of Research, which is a project about research centres. And incidentally, we are launching that project tomorrow as an SRHE event. So this is just to give you a sense of the context from which we have been conducting these projects and that we're sitting in. Now we'll move on to talk about the first of the two projects that we're talking about today. And I'm just going to set my timer briefly so I don't overrun. So the first project, which was actually two projects kind of nested together over two funding periods, relates to pre-application doctoral communications. The project team, you can see here, I won't run through all of us, but you can see over the two phases, we involved several different actors and included also assistance from an external research consultant. Now to go into what is this phenomenon we're talking about in relation to doctoral admissions, and why should we care about it? Why is it a research culture issue? So we have coined the term pre-admissions, pre-application doctoral communications, and that's it was a sort of missing term in the field. It wasn't something that there was a term for before, something that lots of people talk about all the time, but not something that had an actual term. And we felt it was important to name it so that we could do more work on it. So we define the term as communications that potential doctoral applicants may have with university staff before making a formal application to study. And just need to move faces slightly on my screen. There we go. And often this takes the form of emails from applicants, most often to potential supervisors, but this can also include emails to administrative staff, professional services staff, or academic leaders in this role, such as a director of postgraduate research. As well as emails, this can involve calls, it can involve drop-in, it can involve social media exchanges or conferences. And often the communications may not actually be between a student and a member of staff. It can also be that a member of staff forwards a communication to another actor. So, for example, if the student emails and says, I'm interested, emails the department and says, I'm interested in finding a supervisor, this email can get forwarded on to a supervisor and communication can kind of go from there as well. And we should note, because this comes up quite a lot, that these communications, or PADC as we refer to them as, are seen as absolutely essential in some disciplines, particularly those where it's most common for a student to come up with their own project, and also uncommon in others, like in the hard sciences, where often a student is applying as if they're applying for a job to work as a PhD student on a project. However, there are still PADC communications that happen around those sciences projects as well. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the exact research questions for interest of time, but for the first project, we were looking at web pages. We were looking at the directors of postgraduate research, the program officers and the supervisors and their decision-making processes. And we were looking at what kind of changes at institutional and department levels could result from maybe improving some of these sort of, and there's a very loud car outside my window. I hope you can't hear that. So what kind of changes in terms of inclusivity and equity could come from actually thinking more about this invisible layer of communications that are happening that are not currently often formalized or tracked. For the second project, we focused in more on how doctoral applicants from minoritized backgrounds navigated the process of finding a doctoral supervisor. This is within the sense that that PADC as a phenomenon, these communications are potentially quite exclusionary because many applicants aren't familiar, especially those from minoritized backgrounds or underrepresented groups, aren't familiar with how to apply for a PhD and don't necessarily have personal networks to help with this. So this is where the research culture issue really comes in of how are institutions welcoming applicants to apply. And we also looked at advice videos on YouTube that many prospective applicants consult to try and work out how to find a supervisor and how to apply for doctoral study. Very quickly, our research design included then a web review and this was an institutional case study of Warwick. So we looked at the web pages for doctoral admissions, and then we conducted interviews with directors of postgraduate study and also doctoral program officers. And we then conducted a solicited diary study with 19 supervisors tracking their interactions with potential applicants over a number of weeks, and focus group discussions with those supervisors afterwards, discussing how they make decisions about admissions. For the second part, we conducted narrative style interviews with self-identified minoritized doctoral students, and did a review of 100 YouTube advice videos with a subsample of 10 where we took the most popular ones and did an in-depth analysis of them. I'm now going to highlight some key findings of the project. Though again, this is all quite high level, so anything that anyone wants to ask in the Q&A, please feel free. So when we're actually thinking about that pre-application stage as a stage that may involve some kind of gatekeeping or possibly some almost like automatic turning away of certain applicants who don't feel informed or don't feel welcomed somehow into the process, the web pages are a crucial source of information that applicants turn to. And we found that there was a lot of information for applicants on the web pages, but importantly, and what I want to highlight here is that the web pages often lacked information on, firstly, how decisions were made about admissions. There was a sense of you apply like this, but not a sense of this is what will happen to your application and this is who will be looking at it and how it will be reviewed. And also a lack of information relating to equality, diversity and inclusion in any way, such as students from underrepresented groups are welcome, or if you come from an underrepresented group, these are the opportunities you can apply for. This kind of information was not present on the webpage. And it's often the lack of information that we can spot as being some kind of implicit gatekeeping or exclusion, even if it's not intentional. So the next set of findings I want to refer to is from the directors of postgraduate research and the program officers. And we've sort of, for the purposes of this presentation, spliced these perspectives together, though there were some differences between them. But in a way, this is really the institutional or departmental position. So some of the things we found is that these roles, both the administrative and the kind of academic leadership roles, take very different forms across different departments in the institution, and they also change over time. So anyone who's trying to build in processes for more equitable or inclusive pre-application communications, it can be quite difficult to formalize these and sustain them both across the university and within the department because of the shifting nature of the roles. When we talked to the participants about how much they were involved in pre-application communications, they said that they were, and especially for the administrative staff, they were heavily involved in these kinds of communications. And they were often answering queries and directing applicants to supervisors. What we found, and I think this is quite an important point again for the kind of research culture thinking, is that a lot of the processes around pre-application communications were habitual, as in, oh, this is just what we do, but not necessarily intentional in that they weren't deliberately trying to perhaps create a certain impression of the department as competitive for the doctoral program or something, but they were somehow, just because they kept doing the same thing without thinking necessarily about the effects, it had the effect of creating a certain kind of sense of a PhD program in a department. When we talked to the academic, the directors of PGR, they were certainly recognizing that gatekeeping might be happening in this pre-application stage. But they didn't necessarily see this as unfairly handled. They saw it in terms of recognizing who had already a strong record and a potential for doctoral study. So they weren't necessarily aware of thinking of this as a negative issue. We might disagree with that in some ways. The programme officers were certainly feeling that gatekeeping might be occurring, but they were also expressing frustration with certain candidates, given that they were getting a lot of queries from candidates who hadn't been looking at the web page, and they just had to keep referring them back to the web page. And they were sort of thinking, if they're that keen on doctoral study, why do we need to keep telling them where to look? Shouldn't they have looked already? And there was this sense of that kind of perspective coming through. Just an insight from one of the directors of PGR, you can see here in the speech bubble, saying, I think it's quite complex work. I don't feel 100% happy about it. I think this sort of ambivalence did come through a fair bit, that both the administrators and the directors of PGR were not necessarily feeling comfortable with their role in dealing with this quite informal range of queries that nonetheless seem to shape entry into doctoral education for applicants. Then we turn to the role of supervisors. And this was really fascinating, looking at over a 6-week period, the applicants that were pre-applicants that were contacting supervisors. You can see from the graph at the bottom of the screen, there was quite a variation in terms of the number of applicants that were targeting supervisors during the period, up from 14 to 0. It came through quite clearly that capacity restrictions on the number of students that supervisors can or want to take on increases competition for applicants. That, of course, as soon as there's competition, may lead to exclusion of underrepresented groups. In general, supervisors welcomed the idea of more formal processes that might make these communications more equitable, but they were often not necessarily aware of the processes that were even happening in their own department, and sometimes they were not following the processes. We found that supervisors had developed their own processes for managing these communications, and some were much more active than others in trying to manage these in a fair and transparent manner. And it's also key that supervisors were discerning the knowledge of applicants' identity from their emails, such as gender and nationality. So we're not talking about decisions that are made in a kind of identity vacuum here. You can see on the right-hand side an excerpt from a diary where a supervisor was feeling quite cross about having been targeted by a student who obviously hadn't figured out, maybe hadn't looked at her profile to look enough about her to understand her gender, and had, received this email addressed to Sir, and this had sort of influenced her feeling about how much the student had paid attention to her profile in advance. Then looking at the experiences of minoritized postgraduate researchers. So these were students who'd made it through and were reflecting back on their experiences of applying. And we did find some quite disturbing things, like Harvinder on the left-hand side here, who identified as having a disability and was asked by prospective students, do you need to go part-time? Are you going to be slow? When Harvinder was applying for a full-time degree. There were lots of enabling factors, but we can also touch on the barriers around getting incorrect advice, limited access to information, and limited awareness of EDI issues among the staff. And I just want to then touch on the findings from our online advice video review, which was really fascinating. There is a huge array of online videos, and they cover a range of topics, from identifying a supervisor, finding the interest match with a supervisor, how to draft an email, and so on. We want to highlight that this kind of video content focuses on students adapting to the status quo rather than challenging it, how to present yourself as an attractive applicant rather than querying why applicants have to present themselves in certain ways. Often the videos came from a specific context, such as the US, but didn't necessarily say, if you're applying to the US, this is for you. So it could be misleading. And there was other kind of misleading or unhelpful information. And we were quite concerned about some of the videos that we looked at. I'm going to just very quickly touch on the recommendations. And we produced 3 briefings, which you can find from our website, which lay out these recommendations in detail. So we had 3 sets of recommendations, including that institutions and departments could certainly do more to develop strategies for managing pre-application queries, could certainly develop their web pages, and could certainly give more advice and reflective practice opportunities to staff for thinking about how they're perhaps turning away some applicants before applying. For supervisors, they need to think a bit more about how they manage these communications, how they respond to them, and how they reflect on their ongoing practice. And for potential applicants, we've sort of identified that finding an institution and funding is a major area where students need to be aware. Searching for a supervisor is another one, and contacting a supervisor and what to do about it is another area where more kind of information is needed. So we produced a report from this, and also a professional development activity kit for supervisors. So if anyone in the audience is involved in supervisor development, we have a ready-made activity for discussion, and the 3 briefings that we mentioned. And we also produced our own YouTube advice video, Searching for a Supervisor, to help guide potential applicants in a hopefully more research-informed and balanced way. Here are scholarly outputs as well, and we will circulate these slides to attendees after the event. So thank you for your patience, and I'm going to hand over to Jamie now to present on the MADE project, and we'll take a Q&A across both projects at the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily. Kia ora tātou. Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here. As Emily said, my name's James Burford, and I work with Emily in the Education Studies Department at Warwick, and also co-direct the DEAR Centre. So I'm going to be speaking about the Mitigation and Adjustment for Doctoral Education project, the MADE project today. This again was another project focused on research culture in the doctoral education space. For those of you who are interested in the project, you can have a look at our webpage. Again, this project was funded by Research England Enhancing Research Culture Funding, and you can see the wonderful faces of our team members who worked on this project here. I won't name them here, but all of their details are available on the webpage. Thanks, Emily. So here are the names of our team members. It involved me, Sarah Dahl, and Emily Henderson in Education Studies, and our colleagues in the Warwick Doctoral College, Dan Branch and Rhiannon Martin. We also had a number of research fellows and research assistants working with us, Minu Bajwa Patel, Felicity McGowan, Jess Moody, and Matt Phillips, our project officer. The project was also conducted in collaboration with the UK CGE, the UK Council for Graduate Education, who assisted us with project dissemination and engaging with our colleagues across the sector on this topic that many colleagues are interested in. Thanks, Emily. So let me begin with some definitions about what we're talking about here. Many of you will be aware of these concepts, but there are some overlaps, and often in practice they can bump into each other. So We're talking about here mitigating circumstances, which are defined as significant personal difficulties that have a negative impact on a student's ability to study for or complete academic assessments, including examinations. These are acute, severe, exceptional, outside of the student's control, and circumstances eligible for mitigating circumstances will usually be unforeseen, not possible to cover via reasonable adjustments. So in some institutions, these might be called extenuating circumstances. At Warwick, this is the concept that we use. And then we have a different concept, reasonable adjustments, and these refer to the legal duty of an education provider to ensure that appropriate adjustments for students with disabilities or specific learning difficulties are in place, including to ensure that performance of students during any examination is not disadvantaged. So this hopefully highlights the differences between the two concepts that we were researching in this project. Thank you. So in terms of our project design, we had 3 research questions. The first was to understand how higher education institutions in the UK manage reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances for postgraduate research, and particularly for doctoral assessment. And we wanted to understand what common issues and best practices emerge across the sector. The second was to understand how PGR students and staff understand current reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances, policies, processes, and practices for PGR students with a focus on doctoral assessment, and to understand the barriers to inclusion and also opportunities for improvement at our institution. And then the third question focused on how PGRs who required reasonable adjustments navigated their participation in doctoral studies and assessment, and to what extent and by what means adjustments are applied in practice. So in terms of the project design, it was an exploratory institutional case study, and it prioritised generating detailed multi-stakeholder data set on the policies, processes and practices at Warwick, as well as undertaking a sector policy review. So you can see we're interested in who's involved, how are they involved, and following processes around within an institution to see what happens. Thank you. So in terms of our project design, we conducted a literature review on existing scholarship on PGRs and reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances. As Emily said, we're not going into the weeds with that one, but what I would say is that through that literature review, we developed an understanding of there being a trace and an emerging body of literature on PGRs and reasonable adjustments. However, there is a real lack of research on mitigating circumstances and PGRs. And but both of these areas do require further research. And so we're happy to be able to contribute back into those wider conversations in the field. We also engaged in sector consultations in collaboration with the UK Council for Graduate Education. We held 2 events, one online and one based in London, to gather an understanding of the kinds of common issues that are happening across the sector with regard to MITCircs and reasonable adjustments and PGRs. We also undertook a policy review of existing policy documents, numbering about 50, relevant to PGRs and reasonable adjustments. And we focused in on 6 English higher education institutions for this review. In addition to that, we collected data across our institution. So we conducted key informant interviews with key Warwick staff who are involved in the development of reasonable adjustments and MITCircs policies and their enactment. So those were 12 interviews in total. We also held 7 focus group discussions with a range of different stakeholders. So that included PGRs. We held 3 focus groups with a total of 12 PGRs, focus groups with supervisors, as well as departmental representatives who have a key role and stake in reasonable adjustments and MITCircs at the departmental level. So those are directors of PGR programs, senior tutors, and so on. So that included around 27 participants in total. And then we also undertook narrative interviews with PGR graduates who had required reasonable adjustments for their PGR journey or their PGR assessment. And so we had 3 very in-depth narrative interviews with students. So now I'll briefly summarize some of the findings. A full display of the findings is available in the final report. But here are some kind of key highlights. What we found was that there are still in the sector and in the institution some troublesome perceptions about PGR study. So there's a common perception that regulations for PGRs can or should be less specific, less clear, less formalised, and this can lead to uneven and inequitable implementation of reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances across a wide institution. There's also a prevalent perception that doctoral study is just meant to be hard. It's meant to be difficult, it's meant to be the hardest thing, and this discourse has a really challenging effect on PGR students, particularly those who may require reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances, because it can prevent disclosures and also shape staff responses when students reveal that they might need this kind of support. There is a need for greater policy and guidance around reasonable adjustments and mid-circs for PGR. So across the study, we found there were challenges with the availability and accessibility of policies and guidance. In some cases, it's just very difficult to find if PGRs were included in guidance or policy or not. There's questions about the appropriateness of the guidance. Does it meet the needs of the students who are needing to use it? A lack of clarity of responsibilities. Who needs to do what? What are the appropriate processes that need to be followed? Across the sector, there's a reliance on suspension of studies or extensions, which can have particular inequalities, and that's a real challenge for students, particularly who require reasonable adjustments. And also a reliance on normative timelines for doctoral study. So there's an idea that there is a kind of a length of time that a doctorate should take, no matter what. And so that provides particular challenges for students who might need more time to complete their studies for very good reasons. In terms of some other findings, we've provided some considerations when formulating guidance for reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances. So guidance needs to talk to students where they are, not assuming that students all know the difference between mitigating circumstances and reasonable adjustments. For some students, this is just what they reach for when something goes wrong. And so as institutions, we need to be able to help students find the right pathway to seek support. Policies and processes can't assume static or single conditions that students might have. And there's also a need to make sure that students' first experiences of seeking support within the institution go right. In our study, we found a lot of students were turned off or turned away by challenging interactions when they first saw help or support. Thanks, Emily. In terms of practices for reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances for PGRs, there's a need to increase the kind of literacy of colleagues and professional services about PGR study in general. A lot of institutional processes and procedures are set up with a particular idea of a student in mind, and that student is often an undergraduate student. And so when PGR students try and access services, sometimes they're turned away or not really imagined as the kind of users of these services. There's equally a need to ensure that disability advisors are giving reasonable adjustment statements that are relevant to PGR study and assessment. So if there's templates that disability advisors are using to guide or provide reasonable adjustment statements, it's not helpful for PGR students to be given documents that says you can have more time in your examination or so on. There needs to be a more nuanced consideration of the needs of PGRs in relation to their particular kinds of assessment timelines, assessment modes. Information about reasonable adjustments and mid-circs needs to be disseminated to the right people at the right time. Given the long duration of doctoral study, this presents a particular challenge that needs to be worked through. Students are with us for a long time and have a particular kind of pedagogical relationship with their supervisors and their department. So some careful thought needs to be put in there. And further professional development is often needed for supervisors to help them first understand reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances and their differences, to understand the institutional pathways they take, and to help them understand how they can be supports for their students. In terms of assessment, there's a need to consider continuation points, which may be summative, as well as the final viva. So if in your institution students are having annual reviews or milestone meetings, which may lead to that student not passing, there's a need to consider where reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances provisions fall in relation to that. Quite often there is a focus now on the viva, but there may be other continuation points which we need to turn our attention to. There's a widespread lack of clarity regarding how reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances apply to upgrades in particular, as well as the viva, and a need for standardization with regard to preparation for the viva assessment. So mock vivas provided. Could mock vivas provide an opportunity to trial and rehearse some of the challenges that might emerge, and could they be a useful tool to help to prepare for the final viva? Often we found that PGRs are managing around their institution for vivas and working informally, which is challenging, and it means that that provision is therefore there's no parity. There's a need to sort of bring the management into the responsibility of the institution, and to ensure that that is managed equitably across the institution. The post-viva period is also another key area that needs attention. Often PGRs will be given revisions to do on their doctoral work, and that period can often fall out of funded periods for support. So there is further work that needs to be done there. And the responsibility, of course, is not just on the part of institutions, there's also sector level responsibility here. So funders need to consider whether their arrangements are too inflexible. There's also a need to understand whether international students have access to all of the same kinds of provisions as home students. So we've got, as you can see here, about 50 recommendations emerging from this project. So there's a lot to do. And for those of you who are seeking guidance and support, hopefully that is welcome. But what we've done in our project is broken down the recommendations to key actors. So institutions and departments, individual staff members, students themselves, the wider sector, and researchers. And I'll go over these just very briefly. So in terms of institutions and departments, some key things to do here: reviewing PGR policies and processes, reviewing regulations for reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances to ensure they reflect PGR students, ensuring disability and support services are PGR ready, enhancing inclusivity and transparency of PGR related communications, checking that they are signposting to reasonable adjustments and mid-circs guidance, developing inclusive PGR assessment. So certainly some work to do there about whether universal accommodations can be embedded, increasing visibility of disabled researchers and inclusive research culture more broadly to avoid deficit discourses, and enhancing staff training, development, capacity and confidence around reasonable adjustments for mitigating circumstances and reasonable adjustments for PGRs. So there might need to be further training in that area. There's a range of recommendations for individual staff members like supervisors, program officers, and so on, around the development of their knowledge to advocate and become confident professionals in this area. So what training is available? Are there conversations that can be started to build knowledge and expertise in this area? And how can we enhance approaches to PGR supervision to account for reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances? Where in the PGR students' experience do we start talking about this? How can we avoid assumptions and stereotypes? How do we make sure that we take the lead of the student in understanding what it is that they need? These are some key considerations. For PGRs themselves, there is agency within this community to develop local knowledge and advocate for change, to ensure that they understand where the guidance and policies might be, to seek third-party information if necessary, to make use of peer networks and student representation, to advocate for this area, and where there are opportunities to provide feedback to the university. Within the sector, there's, of course, a key need to consider and reconsider existing sector discourses on ableism and ideas about the doctorate and its hardness. There's a need to review PGR scholarships and funding schemes to anticipate and support the needs of disabled students and guide institutions on how to interpret some existing provisions. And for researchers, there's also a key need to develop the research base on reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances. We need research on international research, the experiences of lived experience researchers, and need to bid for doctoral students to work on this area. We desperately need more knowledge in this space. So again, here are a number of different project outputs from the MADE project. We've developed a project briefing for higher education institutions and academic departments. We have a final report with a large number of recommendations, some of which I've highlighted here. And we are working towards some scholarly outputs to speak back to the research literature in this space and offer a contribution there. So that's it from me. Emily, I'll hand back to you, I think. And yeah, we'd welcome some questions.
Thanks, Jamie. And just one final thing that I felt kind of listening to us both that I should note is that we took Warwick as an institutional case study for both of these projects, and yet are very aware from all of our interactions with other universities that Warwick is no outlier in its practices, that both of the issues around pre-application communications and reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances are sector issues. So in that sense, Warwick isn't what we might call like a bad example. It's very much a typical example, and we have seen positive change in the university since doing these projects based on the outcomes of these projects, and kind of appetite for change. So just felt a little disloyal towards our home university there. So just to sort of contextualize from that point of view. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And yeah, absolutely looking forward to your questions.
So I've got one question at the minute that's submitted, but guys, please do feel free in the Q&A to pop more questions. This question's for you, Emily. It says, did your project seek feedback from those who had inquired about PhDs but had no success?
Thanks so much, Ashley, for that question. So no, we were very much looking at students who had gained entry, and looking back on their experiences. It's quite difficult to locate applicants who haven't gained entry, but what we are looking at the moment is supporting a PhD scholarship which includes that aspect. So if that gets funded, then the PhD student will be looking at this in a particular community. So that's to come, but yeah, that's sort of very much a category of the unsuccessful applicant that needs more work but is hardest to access. Thank you.
So I've got Louise who says, totally agree with the ableism of PGR is hard, but what was the view on pre-existing expectations of potential applicants who would require RA given the nature of the PhD? And then it goes on to say, particularly those with neurodivergence who might find key PhD activities such as lit search writing, fully independent study challenging.
Jamie, can I hand to you for that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. Yeah, there is a careful balance we have to strike here. That there is there are many challenges that come with the PhD, but there are also many ways that students can be supported to meet and rise to those challenges. And I guess what we're trying to do in this project is to ensure that students who have all of the capacities to meet the rigor of doctoral study are not disadvantaged by virtue of their disability or learning difference. So yeah, there are I think there is a need to have conversations about what would make it possible for a student to be able to meet the particular challenges of some of those things that you're mentioning in your question. Yeah, Emily, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add to that one.
I think there are questions coming in, so I think we could just move on to the next one, perhaps.
So the next one is, do you know if any of the recommendations from MADE are being taken forward elsewhere or at Warwick?
Thank you. Thanks, Donna. Yeah, so we've been working really closely with our colleagues in the Doctoral College at Warwick, and a new working group has been set up at Warwick, and the kind of recommendations for the MADE emerging from the MADE project are front and centre for that working group. So happily, I can report that already quite a number of the recommendations emerging from the report have had an effect. So already the Disability Services team at Warwick have redrafted their guidance for reasonable adjustments to kind of take into account some of the best practice learning that we came across in the sector. There's also a process underway to review the wider guidance that's provided for students about the assessments in the PhD itself. So I think already there is quite a lot of appetite for change here, and we're seeing some things are happening quite quickly. Yeah. But if you hear of anybody else across the sector who's using these recommendations, we'd also be really happy to hear about it and to try and track some of the impact of them. But yeah, I know things are happening at Warwick for a start. And if you're interested to know how that's happening, the process of implementation, I'd be really happy to put you in touch with our key colleagues who are prosecuting that agenda. Yeah.
I've got one last question, unless anyone submits any more. Alison says, as a CDT co-director, we find that many of our adjustments are to make parents more able to participate. Did this come up in your study, and was it well or poorly addressed?
Thank you. That's a great question. I can start with this, but I know, Emily, you've done research in this area too. So our particular project was focused on reasonable adjustments in the space of or primarily focused on reasonable adjustments in the space of disability and learning difference. But yes, you're right, reasonable adjustments extend to a range of protected characteristics. One of the examples I think that we used in our study was around a parent needing to attend to the needs of their disabled child or child who had an illness. This particularly comes up in the space of mitigating circumstances. So in that sense, yes, it has come up, but at Warwick, we're still in the process of developing clearer guidelines around how mitigating circumstances apply to doctoral assessment. But again, that conversation is underway. But Emily, I wonder if you had a follow-up to that.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking back to that vignette that was used in the focus groups, there was some. I think at first it seemed kind of obvious to everyone that that having a child who's ill would be accommodated for. It was rescheduling was it a Viva or an upgrade? I can't remember now.
An upgrade,
but
yeah.
But then as it was then unpicked, there were sort of questions of sort of how ill. Is there not another carer who's available to look after the child? I think I think it sort of, once you start unpicking some circumstances, it becomes really hard to work out what the institutional line or departmental line on this sort of thing should be. So I think I think in some senses it becomes quite impossible to find something that suits all parents. And I would kind of I've done research on academics and doctoral students with caring responsibilities accessing conferences, and within my study, the adjustments that different parents felt they needed to conference environments were completely different. You know, some with very young children had different kind of requirements to those who had school age children, and so on. So I think it is a real minefield to try and cater to parents as a category, although of course we are obliged to do that. But I think some departments are more set up for part-time study, for example, than others, or more flexible than others. I think in education studies we have always had a large cohort of students who are both parents and teachers at the same time, and that requires the whole department to be geared towards that student body. So I think there are departments one can turn attention to that are used to accommodating more than others. Thanks for the question.
Haven't got any more questions at the minute, but maybe just a couple of seconds to see if anyone's got any. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time, guys, presenting about your projects. It's really interesting, and I hope it's been useful for people. I'm guessing through the questions that it looks like it has. And I can, if you're happy, obviously, James, you mentioned that people could get in touch with you if they wanted certain bits and bobs. So I could send your guys' email addresses to the delegates if that's okay post-meeting.
Absolutely.
And then fab. And then, as I mentioned, everyone, this will be a resource that will be on the Midlands Innovation website in upcoming days, and also on the DEA resources when I kind of share that. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I don't think we've got any more questions.
Sure. And thanks very much. Thanks, Ellen, for hosting us. It's been a really great opportunity to share our work in this forum. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. But I think everyone can have 6 minutes left for a cup of tea before the next meeting.
Marvelous.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.